One of the most discouraging things for a person of traditional faith has been the onslaught of archaeology against the Bible. We've talked here a number of times about consistencies between archaeology and the Bible. The greatest difficulty when it comes to archaeology and the Bible is the Exodus from Egypt. Part of the problem is that there are no records anywhere in Egypt of the plagues. There's one papyrus that seems to hint at the plagues, but there's certainly not a lot of evidence. There's no evidence for wide-scale destruction across Egypt. Like all of Egypt is brought to its knees. There's no such description anywhere in the archaeological evidence. This has been consistently used as proof against the literal reading of the Exodus, the text of the Exodus. We're going to make a very close reading of the text. We're also going to take a look at some important archaeological facts and geographical facts. And in the end, we are, I believe, going to find that there is a great deal of evidence, as well as, importantly, an explanation for why there is a lack of evidence as well. Our story is going to start with Joseph and his brothers coming down to Egypt, and obviously end with the Exodus. In between, we're going to have a chance to make reference to a great deal of not just Egyptian history, but Egyptian geography, which is going to be an important factor here. And we're going to take a very close look also at the dating of the Exodus, which, as it turns out, is precisely accurate and can be backed up from archaeological sources as being exactly accurate. I'm going to give this, this talk is going to end up being in two parts. There are two reasons for that. Number one, I'm worried that there's simply too much material, and especially given the nature of some of the material in the second half, it's going to require time and explanation and discussion. The second reason, quite frankly, I'm going to see what it feels like to give a 30 to 40 minute class, as opposed to trying to give an hour to an hour and 10 class. So that's why we're going to be in two parts. For those of you who heard much of this the first time around, there are many, many additions. You might recall that I gave a class on Israel and Goshen, in which I talked about some of these issues. There'll be a lot more content and depth this evening to that talk, as well as many revelations. This evening in particular, we're going to see important revelations when it comes to the dating of the Exodus and the rabbinic account of the dating of the Exodus and why it is accurate. Next week, we're going to see hard archaeological evidence, which I believe indisputably proves that the Exodus occurred and that there was significant divine intervention, and there are significant facts on the ground to back it up. But that's still to come. All right, let's start at the start. I'm going to have to do a lot of screen sharing here. So I think when I screen share, you don't see me at all. Maybe you see a little picture of me, but you'll have to bear with me. We're going to do a fair amount of screen sharing here so that you can see the relevant texts and the maps and the dates and all those good things. So we're going to start at the start. Oh, good. I can still see some people. Okay. I don't know how I lost my place here. Please bear with me. Here we go. Sorry. Here we go. Okay. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers in the book of Exodus, and he says, I'll just read the English now. Hurry back to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You will dwell in the region of Goshen, where you will be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all that is yours. There I'll provide for you, for yet there are 5 years of famine to come, that you and your household and all that is yours may not suffer want. So the Jewish people, the sons of Jacob and his sons and his family, they are going to live in the land of Goshen, which is going to place them close to Joseph. Okay, Joseph is the vizier. He is the number 2 in Egypt. That was the way the organization was at the time. Is the person closest to the king of Egypt was his immediate advisor, was the vizier. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly. So the land of Goshen must be really near where the seat of power is. And in fact, that's the case. We're just taking a look at this map here. So this is a map of Lower Egypt. There's a lot more below here that's part of Egypt, and we'll see some of it still this evening. But I want to call your attention to the upper right-hand corner here, otherwise known as the northwest. This is the area that would be closest to the land of Israel. This is the Sinai Peninsula on the right border. And if you just kept going, you get to the land of Israel. And you can see in this upper right-hand corner, now you see all these numbers? These numbers are the numbers of what were known as the nomes of Egypt. Egypt was divided into, let's call it counties, for lack of a better term, or states. So these nomes, these various areas, you can see the 14th nome and importantly, the 19th nome here. Okay. And you see the cities of Tanis and Avaris. Now, Tanis and Avaris are important because, as we are going to demonstrate shortly, the capital where Joseph was and where the rulers were was in Avaris. Now that makes great sense because the land of Goshen is right here in the 19th nome, the 20th nome. This area here is the land of Goshen. It's in a fertile plain in the delta, in the Egyptian delta. And the reason why that's significant is because it was both wonderful pasture land and, by the way, was an important place, important center for the construction or the making of bricks for buildings. Right? We know that the Jews were making bricks. It's quite emphasized early in the book of Exodus. Okay, the clay that settled in the delta was particularly good for making bricks. And in order to make clay, and depending on how much, well, mud with clay in it, and depending on how much clay was in there would determine whether you needed straw as well. Okay, so we know from the story, by the way, that they did need straw in order to improve the quality of the bricks. That wasn't always the case, but either way, the Jews found themselves in an area where brick production was prominent and where they could graze their cattle. And this, in fact, is what they end up doing. Jews basically had 3 occupations in Egypt. They were shepherds, they made bricks, and many of them worked in the mines in Sinai as well. And we have archaeological evidence for that. Anyway, so the reason why Avaris is important to us is because that's where Joseph was. So Joseph and Avaris, which is where the seat of power was at the time of Joseph, and Goshen are right next to each other. So therefore, Joseph says, just to refer us back to the verse, he says, you will dwell in the region of Goshen where you will be near me, you and your child. And that makes sense. If Joseph's going to provide for them, he wants them near them. Plus, it's the perfect place for them to be because they're shepherds anyway. Good. Now, it's important to know that Avaris was not always the capital of Egypt. As a matter of fact, it was only the capital of Egypt for a little over 100 years. The capital of Egypt shifted from place to place. We'll talk about some of those places still this evening, but the capital of Egypt shifted from place to place. The only time that the capital was in Avaris was during the reign of the Hyksos, Hyksos. We'll talk about the Hyksos a little bit more in a moment. Actually, let's talk about them now. It's a good time. Let's take a look at some Hyksos history. I gotta just change up the pictures here. Okay. The Hyksos were a dynasty of Palestinian origin that ruled northern Egypt as the 15th dynasty from 1630 BCE to 1523, otherwise known as the Second Intermediate Period. The name Hyksos was used by the Egyptian historian Manetho, who, according to the Jewish historian Flavius Joseph, translated the word as king shepherds or captive shepherds. Okay. The Hyksos, in brief, the Hyksos were foreign invaders who came from the land of Canaan, and for that matter, north of the land of Canaan. And they actually invaded and successfully took over Lower Egypt for well over a century. They had already begun to emigrate into Egypt, probably at least a century before that. And then eventually, with their numbers and the fact that they developed superior weaponry, they introduced the chariot, for example, to Egypt. So they were able to conquer Egypt. The reason why all of this is very significant is because it helps explain, as we've talked about before, it helps explain a number of things in the Joseph story that are very, very important. The first of which is, gee, doesn't it seem strange that the Egyptians would take a foreigner to be the number 2 in command? It's always been strange. I mean, okay, God's with him and he found favor in the eyes of Pharaoh. It's all well and good. That doesn't mean that a foreigner becomes prime minister. That's quite a jump. What's important to recognize is that Joseph and the Hyksos, who were ruling at the time, were of the same stock, a stock which, by the way, was different than Egyptians. They looked different and dressed differently than the Egyptians. We know that because we know that the Egyptians, when they portrayed various nationalities in their tomb paintings, were very, very specific as to how they drew each nationality. And the Hyksos were clearly foreigners from the land of Canaan. So the Hyksos eventually, after settling in Egypt, they come with an invading force and they take over Lower Egypt. And in doing so, they set up their capital at Avaris. These persons who used to be shepherds but had rejected the shepherding life in favor of becoming the Egyptian ruling elite, warriors and the Egyptian ruling elite. So these persons were of Palestinian origin, and therefore when Joseph appears before the king of the Hyksos of Egypt, and the king finds him favorable, it's very easy to move him up the ranks because he's really one of them. He's from the land of Canaan, and really all he has to do is abandon his shepherding ways and become a modern Egyptian, and he'll fit right in. Okay, so what we've established so far is that the rulers at the time of Joseph were the Hyksos. The Hyksos were of Palestinian origin. They had already been settling in the land for a long time, and then they took it over. And these were, and their capital was at Avaris. Okay. Now we go to the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus is going to introduce us to some important information about the subsequent rulers of Egypt. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Okay, who is this new king? The answer is that we know exactly who the new king was, because the new king is the king that kicks out the Hyksos. We'll take a look at exactly who he is and his name soon enough. But the important thing to recognize is that the Melech Chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadas Yosef, who didn't know Joseph, the reason why he didn't know Joseph was, or because he didn't want to know Joseph. Either he literally didn't know of Joseph, or he didn't want to know Joseph. Either way, because Joseph had already been dead for a long time, which we know from previous verses here in Exodus. But the king of Egypt doesn't want to know Joseph. Why? Because Joseph, and for that matter, all the people from Canaan, they are the remnant of the Hyksos. And the Hyksos took over Egypt, and at least according to Egyptian records, weren't very kind to the Egyptians. Now, Vayomer el Amo, he said to his people, note, he said to his people, Hine am b'nei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu. He said, hold on one second, I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm back. So he says to his people, behold, the Jewish people are too numerous for us. Now that means that he doesn't view the Jewish people as being his people. And the reason for that is because the Jewish people are basically Canaanites and associated with the reviled and hated and feared Hyksos. Therefore, let us deal shrewdly with them so they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. Okay, rise from the ground is probably not a great translation, but the important part is that what are they worried about? That the Hyksos are going to come back. And when the Hyksos come back, they're going to have a very convenient fifth column. They're going to have a very, very convenient group of people to help them out, because the guys from the other nation, those people from the land of Canaan, they're a threat. So what do we have? We have the Hyksos have been thrown out, and immediately there is a concern that the very numerous Bnei Yisrael are a fifth column, which threatens them, and they have to be weakened. They have to somehow or other be prevented from becoming a fifth column. So what do? They basically put them to work, and you know the story. They make them into brick workers, and they make things very difficult for them, etc. Eventually, they decide they're going to throw the babies in the river. You know the story. So let's not go any further with that at the moment. Okay, let's stop screen sharing for a moment. Let me review what we've said so far. And if there are any questions, people can raise their hand and ask their questions. Same thing on Facebook, by the way. Just type in your comments. Okay, so what do we have so far? The Jews come to Egypt at a time, the Bnei Israel come to Egypt at a time which is favorable for them to come because their landsmen are running the show. The Hyksos are running the show. That's why Joseph is able to rise to power. That's why they're able to settle where they settle. The Hyksos are running the show, and Joseph and his brothers and his family fit right in with the rest of the Canaanites. Their capital is at Avaris, which is right next to Goshen, which of course makes perfect sense based on the verses that Joseph, who's in power, has to be near Goshen. By the way, the most solid proof you have that the Hyksos were in charge then is that if anybody else is in charge, they don't live near Goshen. All the other capitals of Egypt are much further away from Goshen. I won't get into details now. We'll get into details in a little while. But the closest other candidate for a capital of the country of Egypt, the entire country, is Memphis. And Memphis was 135 kilometers away by foot. It's a 28-hour walk. That's not very close. Okay. So if he's going to be close to them and they're going to be in Goshen and they're going to be right near each other and he's going to take care of them, there's only one capital that works that's close enough to Goshen. And that capital is the capital of the Hyksos, the very people with whom Joseph would fit in just perfectly. Okay. Let me pause for a minute, after which we're going to take a look at some of the dating issues, as well as we're going to begin to identify or show another proof, I should say, from the Torah for the succession from the Hyksos, and maybe even begin to start down the road of identifying who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is, which will be a big surprise. It's not Ramses the Great, and it's not King Tut. Let me take those two off the table. But first, let's just see what we have so far. If anybody has any questions or comments, make yourself visible, and I will unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. Yeah. You'll need to unmute yourself. Touch screen.
Okay.
Go ahead. I should be able to hear you.
Talking to me?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, sorry, I didn't. So when Joseph was thrown into prison, the Hyksos were already in power.
Yes.
Okay, so the Hyksos were already in power during most of the Jacob and his sons narrative
All
back
of
in
it.
all of it. Okay. Thank you. Did they speak? Did they bring a Canaanite language with them?
So if they did, it wasn't the same language that the brothers were speaking, because there was an interpreter. We know from the story when he's going back and forth with his brothers that there was an interpreter there. So the assumption was whatever the brothers were speaking was not the identical dialect. There were multiple dialects in the land of Canaan, though. It wasn't like there was one language. We have much archaeological evidence for several different language families being in the area.
But the Torah doesn't ever say that Joseph had a hard time conversing with anybody once he was set into slavery or once he went down
Right.
to Egypt.
Right. So it's possible that he spoke their language.
Right. And
that there was no language barrier. The only problem with that, or I should say complication, would be that when he's speaking to the brothers, there's an interpreter. So the brothers, whatever language they're speaking, they assume that the Hyksos are speaking a different language. So Joseph may have learned that language, or he may have come with that language, but it's not apparent to the brothers when they come that Joseph knows their language. It's clear to them that he knows the Hyksos language. I guess, yeah, all Joseph would have had to do was fake the fact that he didn't know whatever language they were speaking, and the illusion would hold up.
Right. Okay.
Rabbi?
Okay, Bob.
You started off by describing the Hyksos pretty clearly in terms of text. Is there a detailed record of what happened during that whole very detailed of that?
Yep, 100%. It's part of the Egyptian historical record. Now, the Egyptian historical record means that nobody knew anything about it until at least the middle of the 19th century or later in the modern era, but it is part of the Egyptian historical record. They're in the list of kings. They were subsumed by the later Egyptians into Egyptian history.
Did they ever conquer before or certainly after? I'm not sure. Or were they pretty much that one time?
So I don't want to say with certainty. I believe that eventually they kind of merge into the Hittites once the Egyptians kicked them out. And we're going to see shortly that the Egyptians did in fact kick them out. And importantly, the year in which they were kicked out is going to be very significant. Okay, let's move on if we may. Okay. So it's time to screen share again. And let's go back here. Okay. We're back to the Hyksos, dynasty of Palestinian origin that ruled northern Egypt as the 15th dynasty, 1630 to 1523 BCE. Now, the reason why we know the year in which the Hyksos were kicked out is because the pharaoh who kicked them out was killed in battle. And there was a transition that year from him to his brother. So we know exactly which switch over in history from king to king. We know the year in which it happened. The reason that we know this, by the way, is that we have the mummy of that king and he has axe marks in his head. So he was killed in battle. But he did successfully in that battle drive the Hyksos out. So in 1523, and now we go back to the book of Exodus, in 1523, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. 1523. Now, there's something very interesting about the text here in the early part of Exodus. Here, verse 15 is an example. Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Going further down, verse 18. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives. Okay. They keep calling him the king of Egypt. Now, in the next verse, it says the midwife said to Pharaoh, but overwhelmingly, the king of Egypt is referred to as the king of Egypt in the early part of the story. And only once he dies, sorry. I know it by heart, honey. Thanks. Okay, once he dies, we're then told that the name becomes Paro. The name switches. The usage is overwhelmingly king of Egypt until that king dies and the Jews pause from their work and they cry out to God, etc. So let's talk about what Pharaoh means and how it's used, because this is very, very interesting and important. Pharaoh, from the Egyptian Per-ah, great house, originally the royal palace in ancient Egypt. The word came to be used metonymically. Now you're going to ask me, what does metonymically mean? Well, I didn't know either, so I looked it up. And metonymically means the substitution of the name of an attribute or adjunct for that of the thing meant. For example, suit for business executive, or the track for horse racing, right? So if you want to talk about business executives, sometimes we just call them suits. Okay, now they're not suits, they're business executives, but they wear suits. They're associated with suits, so they call them suits. The same thing with Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the master of the big house, but the word Pharaoh meant great house. And when did they start to use that name metonymically? In the New Kingdom. Starting in the 18th dynasty, note the years, 1539 to 1292. The Hyksos are out in 1523, and sometime shortly thereafter, you start to see the word Pharaoh used to describe the king of Egypt. It was never, as we continue in here, it was never the king's formal title, though, and its modern use as a generic name for all Egyptian kings is based on the usage of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so what does this tell us? At the very least, it gives us a hint to the fact that the kings of the 18th dynasty are the ones who enslaved the Jews. Although the word enslaved technically is incorrect, we might dabble with that next week. But the bottom line is, we'll keep using that term. The oppressor kings were the ones who, you had a Melech Mitzrayim, somebody who's called the king of Egypt, and then the pharaohs began, and these were the oppressors. These are the kings of the 18th dynasty, which are the ones that follow immediately after the Hyksos. Okay. So we're getting a better idea and a closer idea that the kings that we're looking for are somewhere in that historical period, or it's going to be the king of the Exodus. We'll narrow it down much further eventually, but for the moment, that's what we have. And so now we're going to turn our attention to the question of dating. Okay. The rabbis tell us that the actual enslavement, not how long the Jews were in Egypt. The Jews were in Egypt for 430 years. We're not going to get into the details of exactly how long. That's not our problem this evening. But the rabbis tell us that we were enslaved for 210 years of actual servitude. Okay. This is rabbinic fact. So now we're going to see something very, very fascinating. This might be the last thing we cover this evening, but let's see, maybe not. Why isn't that open? I want to screen share this, and it will not give me the option. Basic, advanced. Oh, no, that can't be. That would be really bad. Dear, I have to call my expert teacher, my wife, and see if she can figure this out. I don't know what the snafu is. Oh, I could probably do it that way. Hold on. All right, we're on pause. I apologize. Home, Exodus dating. I assume you cannot see a spreadsheet right now. No. So let's see one more time. Let's try to zoom this. And if not, I have to pull a trick, which will take about a minute or two. Share screen. Got it. There we go. Okay. Somebody unmute yourself and tell me you can see that spreadsheet. Or nod or something. Actually, I can't see you. So what's the point of my asking that?
I can
All
see
right.
it. Looks beautiful, yellow.
Spreadsheet, right? You got a spreadsheet? Great.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, the date of the Hyksos, which includes Joseph, is in there somewhere. The start of the reign of the Hyksos. And I have to say, by the way, when you're dealing with Egyptian dates, there's also always a certain amount of play because of the way that the Egyptians recorded their dates and recorded their reigns of kings. Okay, I'm working with Britannica's dates, which are as reliable as any. The Hyksos start in approximately 1640, and their end, which we have a more definitive time on, is 1523 years. Now, were the Hyksos, if the servitude started when the Hyksos ended, and the Bible seems to say that, new king arose and immediately says to his people, we better do something, and they start to oppress the Jews. 210 years of service later, and please keep in mind these are BCE years, would mean that the servitude ended in the year 1313 before the Common Era. That would be 210 years of slavery. Okay, let's plug in some numbers. The current year, LBH, that's Hebrew, that's a Hebrew transliteration for Libriat HaOlam, from creation. Now we count our years, right? So we're now in 5781. Good. We also know, rabbinically, by the way, that the Revelation, and hence the Exodus, was in 2448 from creation. That being the case, the Exodus from Egypt would have been 3,333 years ago. Right? That's straight math. So far, so good. Our current year in the Common Era is 2021. If you subtract 3,333 years from that number, the number you're going to get, keep in mind, is going to be BCE, before the Common Era. But if you subtract that number, the year that you get for the Exodus, based on 210 years after the Hyksos, based on the Revelation being in 2448, the year of the Exodus would be exactly, or within a year, which is, as far as I'm concerned, pretty exactly the same as the end of 210 years after the Hyksos. I am unaware of anyone who's done this math before, but be that as it may, whether it's been done or not, the conclusion is very, very straightforward. And that conclusion is that if the servitude starts at the end of the era of the Hyksos, which makes perfect sense, because that's exactly what the verses say. The verses say a new king arose and he was worried about a fifth column that wasn't his nation. So the Egyptians regain power. And in regaining power, they begin servitude of 210 years. From the time they regain power, 210 years takes you to the year 1313, which BCE, which is pretty much spot on. Very hard to argue with a couple of months. Okay. 1312 for the Exodus. And actually, if the current year were 2020, it would be 1313. So it would work out perfectly. So anyway, you get the idea. So what we have here, I will submit to you, is firm proof that the servitude happened immediately after the Hyksos reign. And it happened for exactly as long as the rabbis told us that it happened. And the Exodus happened exactly when the rabbis tell us it happened, namely 2448 Libriat HaOlam, 3,333 years ago, 1312 BCE. Simple math based on exact historical dates that we happen to be fortunate enough to have because of the strange situation that the Pharaoh who drove out the Hyksos died, and we know what year he died. And based on all of that, ladies and gentlemen, we have ironclad proof for the dating of the Exodus and for the length of the servitude of the Jewish people in the land of Egypt. I'm going to pause for questions and or comments. I'll stop screen sharing. If anybody has questions or comments, you know what to do. Raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead. There we go. Go ahead, please. Yes.
So I'm completely blown out of the water. It's almost like I have nothing left to say.
You ain't
It's
seen nothing
so-
yet. Wait till next week.
It's so intense, you know? This is really, I wish that this was known the years going back. It must have been, I can't remember how many years back, when a rabbi got up, not a rabbi from this particular community, and basically told us that the entire story of the Exodus is
Rabbi Mark Wolpin from Los Angeles. Yeah.
okay, and it reverberated throughout the entire Jewish community.
Right.
And as a time, it was extremely demoralizing because it was like losing everything you ever believed in.
Call from Far Rockaway and
So it's thank you for
Yeah. Listen, wait till next week. There's so much more here. Once you start digging, there's no end. I'm going to momentarily, by the way, give you a little teaser for next week, just to make sure
Rabbi?
everybody comes back. Yeah,
Rabbi?
Bob.
The whole basis of the calculation is based on that revelation time.
Yep.
Come on. Okay. So could you explain a little bit more about the origin of that number? Because everything else falls right out of it.
Right. So this is actually, I'm glad you asked this because this is a very important question about historical records in general. Modern academic historians, and this really goes back to a bias that's before the modern era, but modern historians basically say, if it's not in writing, it's not history. So they basically discount anything that they don't have written records of, they discount as not having been part of history. Now, this is extremely strange because no one earlier in history ever said such a thing. Everybody understood that oral traditions were passed down within communities and passed down with a very great degree of precision, were passed down in history, especially important dates and important events. And this isn't just something that the Jews did or the Egyptians or the Babylonians. This is every culture in the world. Cultures kept oral histories and they had institutions to make sure that their oral histories were preserved from generation to generation. The rabbis have also, and you find a lot of this in the Midrash, the rabbis also kept oral track. They had oral histories. And based on that oral history, they have given this, we have this date of 2448 for the Exodus. Now, previous to that, I could not have pinned that date down for you in any way because if you try to go forward, it's a little difficult whether you try to go forward to the Exodus in the Bible or, sorry, if you try to go backwards from the Exodus or you try to go forward from the Exodus in time, it's hard to get precision from the text itself. But the rabbis have always maintained 210 years and 2448. And it just happens to work out exactly right. Surprise. Why? Because we shouldn't be surprised. The idea that history, oral history, is not a reliable source of history is a modern bias, which I will tell you, the Greeks certainly did not have. I can tell you that Plato constantly quoted all sorts of oral testimonies and accepted them as history and fact. Why? Because he talked to the people who had those stories and he asked them all the questions and he concluded that in fact they were reliable oral histories. So we too also have an oral history. And in this case, it happens to be that it works out perfectly with the dating that we were given, works out perfectly with the archaeological evidence for the expulsion of the Hyksos. And the 210 years just takes you exactly to a date, which is exactly the date the rabbis have been giving. Okay. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser for next week, and then we're going to stop. L'chaim. Ginger ale. I'm sure I'm holding it wrong. Okay. Yeah, sure. Ginger ale. Yeah, Rabbi. Sure. Anyway. Throughout the story of the Exodus, Moses keeps going to Pharaoh, having conversations with Pharaoh, coming back. Conversation with Pharaoh, coming back. Talks to the Jewish people, goes to Pharaoh, comes back. There's a little bit of a problem with that. And that problem is a simple problem of geography. Time to share the screen again. Let's see, this should be right. Okay. So let's go back to our map of Lower Egypt. And I remind you that up here in the upper right-hand corner, is the city of Avaris, which was the capital city for the Hyksos kings and where Joseph lived and right near Goshen. The later kings of Egypt were nowhere near Goshen. The two candidates are Memphis, which you can see here, but I'll show you again on a better map momentarily, and Karnak. Let me show you on the map where these two capitals were. This is Karnak down here. In order to get from Karnak to, you see at the top, Tel al-Daba? Tel al-Daba is Tanis. Is Avaris. The walk from Avaris to Karnak is 152 hours, which certainly makes it seem that it could not be that whoever the Pharaoh was that Moses was talking to lived in Karnak. Your other candidate is Memphis. So let's see how far it would take you to get to Memphis. Remember, no helicopters. If you walk to Memphis, it's only a 28-hour walk from Memphis to Tel Daba, which also does not sound very much at all like the story that we have. Moses went to Pharaoh and he came back and he went out and he said, when would you like me to do this? Tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow. He left it. It doesn't fit the narrative well at all. But what really doesn't fit the narrative is the fact that we actually know where the Pharaoh that Moses was talking to did live. And it wasn't in the capital. I refer you to Psalm 78. This is one, not the only source, but one of the sources. And here, God is talking about that the Jewish people did not keep God's covenant. They refused to follow his instruction. They forgot his deeds and the wonders that he showed them. He performed marvels in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, the plain of Zoan, actually Zoan. There should be a dot under the Z to make it a tz. So the plains of Zoan. We know exactly where Zoan was, and that's where Moses performed his miracles before Pharaoh. The Pharaoh in the story where Moses performs all his miracles and he smites the river and he throws dust in the air and there are boils. All of this happened in Zoan. We know exactly where Zoan is. Zoan is Tanis. See this right here? Up here? That's Zoan. That's where Moses did his plagues. The problem is no Pharaoh ever sat in Zoan. The closest, again, that any Pharaoh ever sat was in Memphis. As a matter of fact, you could even argue, and I will argue next week, that the Pharaoh, the big king of the Exodus, was in Memphis. But that can't be who Moses is performing his miracles in front of, because Moses is in Tanis. What we are going to find is that many of the problems that we have with the story of the Exodus can actually be answered by this simple geographical oddity, not the least of which is as follows. The Jewish people lived in Goshen. I'm sort of running a little circle around where Goshen was. It's basically the 19th and 20th nome here. Okay, that's where they lived. Egypt itself is much, much, much larger than that. Again, I refer you to, let's get rid of Memphis for a second, just to go to Karnak. And the reason why I'm choosing Karnak and Luxor is because it was much further south. Egypt actually went all the way down here. For example, Edfu was part of Egypt. Egypt was much further down. Let's see, can I move this map here? Here we go. Okay, so Egypt was more or less from where I'm drawing this line all the way up to here. The Jews only lived, and again, here you see Tel El Daba, the Jews are living in this area. Can someone explain to me why it is that the entire country of Egypt was devastated? They couldn't have possibly all been participating in the oppression of the Jews, because the oppression of the Jews was localized around here. So it would be very, very difficult to understand from a divine justice point of view that people living in Cairo or in the middle here or down here, these people who probably never met a Jew in their life because they were literally hundreds of hours by foot away from them. These people were living in pasture land up here in the Delta. These guys are all down here in different places. Why are all these people suffering because of what's being done to the Jews up here? And what I'm going to submit to you is, although I won't get into exactly how I'm going to prove this now, or even all of the details, of course, but what I'm going to submit to you is that our understanding of the plagues and the victims of the plagues and the Pharaoh and who Moses was talking to has been slightly distorted over time, which makes the story much more difficult to understand. And that once we understand some of the geography and some of the ways that the governance was set up, we're going to get a much better understanding of the story in general. But not to worry, the guys down here did not get off scot-free either. After all, the big king was either somewhere here around Memphis area or down in Karnak. The big king got his too. We'll see this explained. It's actually very clear from the verses and from a unique archaeological fact that I would be stunned if anyone knows, outside of a very small cadre of archaeologists who I happen to follow and have communicated with. and have emailed, it's going to turn out that we have rock solid archaeological proof that they got theirs, so to speak. The people down here, the big king got his, but that most of what happened up here in Goshen. Not all of Egypt. But that's next week. So until next week, and again, I'll take questions and comments, but until next week, that's what we've got for today. Okay. Esther, is that a hand up? Wait. No. Esther is saying no. Yes or no? No. Okay. That's cool.
Same time, next station, same time, same station next week.
Same time, same station next week. Flyers will go out, part 2. Believe me, we'll rock your world.
No, I
at
know the
least as much
exact
as this
answer to
did.
your question.
What?
I know the exact answer to your question.
Go ahead, Paul. Tell me.
I'm not going to tell you till next week.
Okay, good, good. Thank you. Thank you. Don't steal my thunder, Paul. Don't do it to me, please.
Thank you,
All right,
Rabbi.
y'all. We'll
Thanks,
be back
Rabbi.
again
It's
next
very
week.
good.
You're muted.
Thank you for being here this evening. It was really good to be able to teach Torah as always, but especially it's the first time I'm teaching really since I had my incident. I think everybody at this point kind of knows I had a heart attack. So thank God. It's really, really good to be able to be out there and participating and to be with you. And I appreciate all of your support. Pretty much everybody here has called me or reached out. And even if you haven't, that's cool. Don't worry about it. But just a pleasure to be with you here this evening.
even
Thank
know.
you. And we will
We
be
didn't,
back.
we didn't know, Rabbi.
We didn't know.
Yeah. Minor heart attack. I have 100% function, thank God. And
Good.
it's just doctors and medicine for the rest of my life, but I should make a 100% recovery. Thank
Glad
God.
to hear that.
I had the little one, and it's a good thing because the big one would have been much worse.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all. Pleasure to be with you, and we'll see you next week.
See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.